Now, it's been nearly 2 years since Niger's military rulers threw out President Mohamed Bazoum and quietly held him and his wife under house arrest without ever charging them or even giving them a day in court. Human Rights Watch is now urging the junta to free them at once, calling their detention arbitrary and in clear violation of both regional and international law. But this is not only about one couple's freedom. HRW, that's Human Rights Watch, also slams the wider clampdown on dissent, that's journalists being silenced, activists being intimidated, and the promised handover back to civilian government repeatedly postponed. To them, keeping Bazoum locked up is a warning shot that legal norms and democratic habits in Niger no longer matter. But with mounting diplomatic and public pressure from the ECOWAS, the UN, and other partners, many are asking, if the junta finally relents and lets Bazoum go, will it mark a genuine turn back towards democracy or merely a bow to international demands? To speak more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Goodluck Norum. He's an African Affairs analyst in Ogun State, and also Haruna Warkani, his former ECOWAS diplomat in Abuja. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
So let me begin with Dr. Norum. Mr. Bazoum has now been held for nearly 2 years without charge or trial. Why would you say the junta kept him in detention despite ECOWAS and UN rulings declaring it arbitrary?
Well, thank you so much for having me. For talking about the reason why the junta detained him, is somewhat, don't forget that this came at a time when it looked like the political landscape in Africa, West Africa, so to say, a hit. When you look at it from, I think it's Guinea now, I think either Guinea or Burkina Faso, there was a coup that happened, and then there was almost one that was supposed to happen in Gabon, and then looking at what has happened at Niger. Now, for me, the reason for his detention had something to do with mounting security crisis, as well as an alleged misrule. All right, and then there was also a consideration for the fact that it was as if Bazoum's plan was to consolidate power for himself. And then there were complaints of treason and what we call treacherous diplomacy, all right? Because they felt that as much as possible, the president, as at then, Bazoum, had probably committed some treasonable offenses. So these reasons, amongst all others, could have led to his detention.
Okay. Now, I'm being told that we're joined by Dr. Henry Ekine has actually joined us. He's a human rights lawyer in Rivers State. Thank you so much for joining us, Henry. Before we come to you, Henry, let's continue with Haruna. Haruna, now, does the fact that Niger formally withdrew from ECOWAS in January 2025 void the court ruling or even affect obligations under international law for the former president to be released?
Thank you so much for having me. First and foremost, the circumstances surrounding the arrest and detention of President Bazoum then was very, very clear. There was no way the military junta in Niger could have ousted him from power and allowed him to just go freely, because it became obvious that France was deeply behind him and indeed refused to recognize the new government in Niger. Therefore, if you are anyone within the junta, you will understand why they cannot possibly release him. 2, the hostility meted out to Niger by ECOWAS was too clear, and therefore the question of releasing Bazoum hinged on the fact that you cannot release such a person because he will amount to like a tiger in the wild. And the government needed to consolidate power for itself, first and foremost. The issues of human rights and democracy being raised are by the side, because now we are in a new space, we are in a new phase, we are in a new setting. And so one has to understand clearly the hostility of France, for instance, for refusing totally to recognize the new military junta in Niger became much of a problem. History has also shown that such a people, when released, most likely are going to find refuge in France or Europe or elsewhere. And when they do, these countries will provide a very good breeding ground for insurgency and the rest of them. We must also recognize the fact that President Bazoum was linked deeply with the insurgency in the north, particularly Agadez and the rest of them. So his kith and kin, that's the Tuaregs in northern Niger, have been very much with him in such a way that the government mistrusted him completely for use of state power to promote regional or ethnic interests. And therefore, it's very easy for us to understand why he couldn't have been released, and neither now can he be released. ECOWAS cannot be a guarantee for him to be released either, because ECOWAS has created this bad blood between itself and the Sahel states in particular, and Niger specifically, because of the intended invasion. So the conditions and circumstances are so multifarious that allowing Bazoum to go home just freely without conditions and conditionalities will be almost impossible to imagine. The regime has not set any date for return to democracy. And when you talk about democracy in a setting, you are only creating more problems because the regime will feel threatened.
Absolutely. Now, let's hear from Henry. Henry, we know that in June 2024, the junta lifted, his presidential immunity through a process described as failing to meet due process standards. Would like to know if this carries, or this proceeding carries, any legitimacy, and also how credible are the junta's announced charges of high treason and undermining national security when no preliminary hearings, have actually taken place?
Like in Nigeria and most constitutions of nations, the Constitution of Niger, 2010, I believe, vested ordinarily some sort of immunity, or provided some sort of immunity on the president. But usually, when military junta gets into government or an incursion, they usually will suspend constitutional provisions and those guarantees on rights of citizens, and then those democratic principles in the Constitution. That would mean that by virtue of the coup that ousted Mohamed Bazoum, it became clear that the junta wasn't running or ruling or carrying on the administration in Niger, just like the other countries that have formed the alliance of the Sahel states, not by the Constitution of Niger, but some military decrees. And to that extent, the courts, of course, which were usually allowed even when there is that constitutional suspension, as it were allowed to determine whether it will continue to protect, or in some consideration, whether the president that has been ousted could still wear that cloth of immunity. But without even going to the court, by that suspension of the Constitution, the protection of the president with immunity would have been lifted. But the Constitutional Court had also again last year lifted that immunity. That was an expectation indeed. And then one further expected that it would have opened the door for a possible prosecution of the ousted President Bazoum, whether rightly or wrongly, whatever allegation they were going to level against him of some allegation of treason, or even the suspicion that it was going to compound insecurity in the nation, in the state. But that didn't happen. And up till now, it hasn't happened. So for me, constitutional guarantees of the rights of citizens and individuals, particularly the rights so the ousted president, arguably here appear to be suspended. Yes, the Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations would not subscribe to any suspension of the rights of citizens guaranteed anywhere in the world, but it becomes a limitation when we have in that society some democratic rules suspended and then having a military junta. We suffered that in Nigeria sometime, and of course it's also in other countries that are being governed by military junta. So it's unfortunate that the right of Bazoum is being violated here. It's important to state that he has the right to be tried. He has the right to be presumed innocent. The Constitution of Niger, but all international instruments on the protection of rights of citizens and individuals across the world.
Okay. Now, let's go back to Dr. Norum. Dr. Norum, activists and journalists, are increasingly being censored or even self-censoring. In fact, one civil society member warned that if you criticize the government, that you risk being arrested. And also remember in June 2024, where Niger's cyber law crime, was amended to reinstate prison sentences for online dissent, and the Maison de la Presse, organizer of 32 media groups, was suspended in January 2024 as well. Why are these voices being silenced? Why are these free voices being silenced?
When it comes to the government, especially in Africa, the government doesn't like to be criticized. They don't want to be told that they are doing what is not correct or what is not constitutional. And so sometimes you find the government taking advantage of the provisions of the law to enact policies, all right, or decrees that would censor journalists, especially those that are open to criticizing the government, all right? So the issue concerning censorship, all right, of journalists is just like I said earlier. The government doesn't want to be criticized. They don't want to be told that they are doing what is wrong, all right? They don't want to hear the truth. And that is why sometimes some journalists, instead of having any challenge or running into any crossroad with the government, they even try to censor themselves. It is true that online we need to be careful of what we say, especially when you're a journalist. But then again, the truth ought to be told. But people now find clever ways of telling the truth so as not to get on the wrong side of the law.
Okay. Mr. Wakani, now ECOWAS actually threatened possible military intervention in August 2023, I remember then, but they backed off as well. Would you say that the junta's alignment with Russia and Mali and Burkina Faso has strengthened its grip?
Well, that was the greatest mistake made by ECOWAS, first and foremost, to have attempted to raise a military force against a member state. That was a grievous mistake because it's not an external aggression. And so that mistake has been recorded and unfortunate. It has divided ECOWAS into what we have today as the two spheres, Sahel and the ECOWAS. Now, it has emboldened these governments in the Sahel states because they have seen clearly that ECOWAS was unable to do what it ought to have done at the right time. And so they have decided to take their fate in their own hands, exercising their sovereignty for themselves rather than for the organization that didn't seem to have anything to do with their welfare. So we must understand very carefully what has happened. We must also understand the way the civil population has accepted these changes in the Sahel states. It became obvious that people were fed up with what they call democracy because the so-called pseudo dividends of democracy was simply not trickling down to the masses. And so when these coups came around, you could see the euphoria of the citizenry happy, and today it become obvious that the policies of these Sahel states are actually progressive than the democratically elected governments that they have overthrown. So it's a very nexus question that needs to be addressed over time. And so the legitimacy of this government is kindly being reinforced. They have left ECOWAS and they have said so they are not coming. ECOWAS has tried its best to bend down and bend backwards and make matters easy for them to come back, including, for instance, the retaining of staff of these Sahel countries within the ECOWAS community up to this moment. This is an unprecedented move, just to allow these Sahel states to have a second rethink and say, okay, we are coming back to the fold. However, it's proving very difficult because the fundamental issues that had brought about some of these changes have remained as a very wide chasm between ECOWAS and the Sahel. And these governments, as long as they are touching lives positively, I think they will continue to be relevant in their communities. And so the concept of democracy itself is being challenged, not just in West Africa, but across the continent of Africa. Because if democracy does not translate into development for citizens, then it has no meaning, absolutely no meaning.
Absolutely. All right, now let's hear from you, Henry. Henry, so if Bazoum were to walk free tomorrow, what steps will be needed to restore constitutional order, and how feasible is reconciliation in a deeply polarized Niger?
First, would always, constitutional democracy, it's asserted that legitimacy of any government would have been that is drawn from the people. But the question here is when you have a junta or an unconstitutional administration that appears to be acceptable by the people, it raises another level of consideration. So if the people seem to have accepted the military junta and then are patient waiting for a seeming transition arrangement for a constitutional government to be established, then I think that it will raise another consideration to the extent that the people appear to be a bit comfortable compared to when even the civil democratic administration had the government in control. But for Mohamed Bazoum, I think what is and most important for him is actually his liberty, his right to at least regain some sort of liberty, even if it is not within Niger, but grant him that opportunity to be able to freely move out of Niger or move around within Niger in some sort of probably, if they even want to prosecute him, then grant him the opportunity to defend himself. That, I think, would be what's important to Bazoum at the moment, not quite about constitution and then instituting constitutional government in that regard. But for the junta, I think for now, it appears to be a period that's not probably sufficient for them to be able to prepare, not forgetting the challenges they had, like my colleagues have also discussed, in the beginning with ECOWAS, and then the reaction that ECOWAS had, and even the challenges they are having with their colonialists in some way, whether it appeared direct or indirect, but they had some challenges to be able to stabilize and then focus on administration of the people. But what will, again, be interesting for us observers is whether the people are actually going to be interested in some form of transition just so soon. We haven't quite, observing the three states of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, it doesn't appear yet that the people are now really.
All right, Henry. Well, sadly, it's time for us to leave. If you can hear me, Henry, we apologize, for the break, but it's actually time to wrap up this conversation. But thank you so much, Henry Ekine, a human rights lawyer in Rivers State. We also had Dr. Goodluck Norum, African Affairs Analyst in Ogun State, and Haruna Warkani, former ECOWAS diplomat in Abuja. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and for joining us on today's package.
Thank you so much for having me.